I'd like to introduce our panel. We have Councillor David Gibson, Councillor Mary Mears, Duncan and Tracey Hill, representing... Sorry? Councillor Tracey Hill, I beg your pardon. Representing each of their parties this evening. I'd like to thank you all for coming. This is an opportunity for you to be able to hear what our panellists have to say, but also to be able to tell them and show the energy and enthusiasm that there is in Brighton Hove for community-led housing. It's something that was really palpable at the evaluation day that we had a couple of weeks ago, and I really had the impression that we had very many different groups all trying to develop community-led housing, although people came from very different backgrounds, and it really gave me the feeling that anybody could be part of this if they wanted to. That's the feeling that I truly came away with. So this is our chance to be able to portray some of that to the representatives that we have here this evening. So each panel member is going to have 5 minutes to lay out their stall in a way, and we've had some questions that we've asked them in advance and some information that they have had about community-led housing in the city, nationally and internationally. We have our own local housing manifesto for Brighton and Hove on local community-led housing, which we'll make sure we put on the website later this week as well, so people can have a look at it. We've shared that with the panellists as well. So after that, we'll be able to have questions from the audience, and we need to be finished by 8 o'clock. Does that all sound okay to everyone? Yeah? Okay. So shall we go from one end to the other? Yeah. We're doing the 5 minutes. 50-50. People at the end can choose which end starts on. Are you happy to start, Councillor Hill?
Yeah, I can start.
Okay.
So can everyone hear all right?
Yes.
No, some people
yes.
Is that, well, I'll just have to, so I can stand up.
Yeah.
No, why don't I stand up?
I think it's better to stand.
Okay. So nice to see so many people here. I'm Councillor Tracey Hill. I am with the Labour Party, so I'm currently the chair of housing and new homes at the council. I've been in that role for about 3 weeks. And I'm really pleased to be here tonight. I've been to a number of different community-led housing events over the time that I've been deputy chair. And one of the questions we've been asked to answer is which current community-led housing projects do you admire and why? And you know, I think there's a lot to admire. I went into the site, at the bunker site, recently, and that was fantastic because there's something really great about actually seeing something in the process of being built. And what I love about community-led housing groups is that it's a group of people who don't necessarily, you know, it's not their profession or anything, but they get together and they literally make something out of nothing, and I think that can be really exciting. And you know, some of the other events, there was an AGM that I went to, and a massive event at the Brighton Hove. There's just so much enthusiasm in the city, so much skill, and so many people who really want to put a lot of time into this, that I do think it's something that we need to encourage. And I should mention also Coldine, because there's a really exciting plan to develop a site. Site 21A, they're calling it. I think they need a better name,
yeah.
But
like
there's some really interesting stuff going on up there. Do you think, this is another question, do you think community-led housing has been accorded a high enough priority within housing policy and practices to date? Well, in theory, we have given it a great priority, and I think one excellent thing that's happened over the last 4 years is the grant that the council awarded to set up a community-led housing support hub and to develop a pathway, and what that should mean and is meaning is hopefully that it is a lot easier for people to get together, to get into a group, to make progress and really sort of negotiate what you need to do in order to get these things up and running. And I'm just really pleased that we've done that. What I think we need to do next is perhaps have a bit of a change of mindset, so that we see community-led housing. It's not people asking for a favour, actually, but it's people who can help us solve the housing crisis in this city through the experience and enthusiasm that they have, and through us just being willing to look at all different ways of providing housing, different types of sites and so on. So and I think that there is more that we can do in that way. What single thing would you do to help grow more community-led housing in the city? In our housing manifesto, which is going to be released tomorrow, and it's going to be up on our website tonight, in fact, what we are committing to is that a Labour council will, within 6 months of a new administration, identify 10 sites within the city for community-led housing, and that we will work with groups to progress them. That is something we absolutely want to do. We want to put a number on it, we want to put a timeline on it, because it's all very well saying it's a great idea, but what we need is sites and plans and for things to progress. So that is absolutely something that we really want to do. And the other question was about loans. Can the council enable a loan? And the answer to that is that we absolutely think that we can, and that, again, a Labour administration will look at setting that up so that we'll be borrowing money through the Public Works Loan Board, as we have done on other projects, in order to make financing available at market rates, because it has to be, unfortunately, to community groups, in order so that they have some money up front, which will enable things to move more quickly. And again, it's a matter of translating all these ideas into practice. And at the moment, we've got the ideas, we've got the groups, we've got quite a lot of know-how, but we need sites and we need financing. I think we're really well placed to do that right now, and I'd really like to be part of the administration that makes that possible.
Thank you.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much to Rita and to the Community Land Trust for making us all feel so welcome. There is a housing crisis in the city. Cost of living is spiralling. There are 15,000 on the social housing waiting list, and there's been a visible explosion in street homelessness over the past few years. Solving this will require national changes, like allowing councils to end the right to buy, but also local action, such as actually meeting affordable housing targets and having the council work with as wide a variety of providers as possible. This should include community housing groups, as the crisis is not just a crisis of numbers, but also a crisis of diversity. Developers profit most from luxury flats or large identikit houses built at far too low density. In contrast, community housing is inherently more varied, from cooperative blocks of flats to medium density co-housing options to specialist housing. For instance, at your event, was it last weekend? Weekend before, I saw Sussex Homeless Support, who are looking to build quick and cheap temporary accommodation for the homeless to plug the gap between emergency accommodation and fully independent living, as often the solutions available right now do not fit the needs of the individuals being taken in. Overall, I think that community housing places far more of a value on community assets than for-profit developers do, encouraging an awareness that good development does not simply mean more houses. It can also mean cultural aspects, commercial aspects as well. For example, the Colding Community Organisation plans to develop new homes, but it also plans to build a community centre to permanently host the Bevendine Gymnastics Club, which has been without a permanent home for decades at this point, and possibly, if the money stretches, to house commercial units as well. Which I think is an excellent model of development. Cooperative and co-housing models also involve the use of shared resources, which can foster community cohesion and also make more efficient use of space, which we're sorely lacking in the city, given our geography between the sea and the downs. For these reasons, I believe that the council should treat community housing as a core principle and not as an afterthought. Identifying council-owned sites suitable for different community housing models in the next city plan would make land purchase easier. I found it was a little bit stolen from that one by Tracey's speech, but nevertheless, I think that would help. With regards to the idea of having loans from the council, unfortunately, I do think that if the council were to take out loans at below market rate, it would be very difficult to then pass on those loans at below market rate without also offering it to for-profit developers, which would negate the benefit. Although, as has been said, passing them on at market rate is completely viable, and I would be very happy indeed to be proven wrong on this. So I'm delighted to have been invited to this hustings. I'm delighted to be part of this evening's conversation, and I hope we can come up with constructive proposals, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I haven't actually written a speech. I just wanted to actually sort of say a bit about me first. I was first elected on the old Brighton Council quite a few years ago, and I've always majored on housing. The first ward I was in was the old Marine ward, which took in the whole of Whitehawk and the lower end near the seafront. So it gave a really good view as to what was needed around housing. Very good lesson to learn for any new councillor coming forward. And as a councillor, I've always majored on housing. Even when I was leader of the council, I took strategic housing into the leadership, because my view on housing is you have to get that right. It should be a top priority in the council and in government, because if you get housing right, children have the space, they can attain their homework, families have a more viable way of living rather than less antisocial behaviour. It's the core, it's the absolute core, and should be for the council, and that's always been my personal view. And I just wanted to talk about I actually live in a South Build. So years ago, people will remember it in here tonight, across the city there were many South Build schemes in Wilson Avenue, Woodingdean, Hollingbury, and these were people that couldn't buy on the property ladder but have skills, and we have those skills in the city today. There are many tradespeople, and the particular scheme that I live in now, which I inherited from my parents who started on a South Build scheme, not everybody has to be a tradesperson. On those schemes you have people that need to be a treasurer or a secretary, so you don't have to have, you know, a trading skill to be part of a South Build scheme. And those schemes in the past were supported by the council. In fact, they had council mortgages, and that's something as a Conservative group we're really keen to look at again. There's an issue around funding which I will address quickly, but actually that because of the lift in the HRA cap, there's an opportunity for councils now to look about giving mortgages, and that's for small groups and independent people. That's some of the hardest things to actually achieve. It's a long way to go. If you've absolutely got to guarantee that, you know, through a self-build or a community project you can get a mortgage, it makes life so much easier. So that's one of the things we will be we're already looking at and want to propose. I'm not actually going to do a party political broadcast, I just really want to talk about housing. The other thing is around financing through the council. We have an opportunity now, they talk about the loan for the I360 and others, but we do have an opportunity with the cap being lifted on the HRA to look at different ways of funding, and that is an opportunity for the council to take. Do I think one of the questions is around community-led projects have been given a high enough priority? No, I don't. But we're election time, so it's a priority for everybody at the moment, so that's how it is, that's politics for you. But I also think as well, community-led projects would save the council an awful lot of money. For those that know, some of us sit on a regeneration board, and across the city we're building affordable housing. Now the cost of some of those affordable properties, I'll give you a quote. Findon Road, that cost 14.4 million to build. Now for me, that is a horrendous amount of money that the council pays to build a site of affordable housing. So, you know, if we turn it on its head and we say, okay, we look at a site, and there are sites and they can be identified, and we look at community groups, self-build, whichever way propose to bring that forward, and the council actually provides a loan and a mortgage, because their repayback time on the housing revenue account is 40-60 years, plenty of time for a mortgage repayment. It actually would cost the council less to provide affordable housing through different avenues and try to deliver through our regeneration team, and I sit on it and it's painful. So I believe we should look at it totally differently. And one of the other questions, I've done finance and around that, but also asked about schemes that I've seen over the years. I've seen many schemes, and some of them have been really, really interesting, challenging, really challenging across the city, but interesting. We talk about bunkers because that's the latest one that's coming forward. But there's other ones across the city. There's one that took place at the top of Wilson's Avenue with a group of residents up there and other parts. And it's the community that they build that is really, really important. It isn't just about the homes, it isn't just about the site, it actually builds a community. And that is an asset to any city, because you're bringing people together, you're working together, you're caring about each other, and you're making things happen. So for me, housing is a priority, always has been a hard priority. Don't know what the local election's going to bring, none of us do. We haven't got a crystal ball, it'll be whatever it's going to be. So I don't intend to do a political spin on it, but I think housing has to be and should be the absolute top priority in any council, and that's my view. Thank you.
Gibson.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. And as everyone will know, I don't really write speeches, I just have scrappy notes, which I need to have in front of me. But I am pledging that just on my final council meeting, which it may be, I'm actually going to have a proper speech, but this is a distraction. So and like Mary, and I imagine everyone in this room, yeah, housing is a real passion and a priority for me. And I think it's worth saying a couple of things. I'm going to talk a little bit about the national context, mostly about the local, and then try and answer your questions in my time allowed. So nationally, you know, what is impinging on our city, the housing crisis, is a shortage of truly affordable homes, and you don't have to be a genius to work out that community land trust can play an important role in that. There's a terrible insecurity in private rented sector, which is and loss of a private rented sector home is usually the largest cause of homelessness in the city, and we're losing truly affordable homes through the right to buy. These are national things, and we can't do anything. None of us here can do much about that at this moment. There are things that can be done locally, and community land trusts are very much about local action, and I believe we've got fantastic potential. I think it's been said already that it harnesses, you know, I don't know about the audience, but I recognise quite a lot of people who are involved in community land trusts. It harnesses your energy, and that's a fantastic resource. You know, for a sort of pressured, cash-strapped council, and housing isn't that cash-strapped, but the rest of the council is, then the energy of people and their ingenuity and their creativity is a fantastic asset, and therefore it has to be, to answer one of the questions, it has to be a priority. And no, it hasn't been high enough of a priority. It has been an increasing priority, which is great, but there's more that we can do. Capital infrastructure grants are something the council can fund. We can do more, and I really welcome the 10 sites pledge, which I shall be studying in the morning, which is really positive. And certainly as a councillor, you know, on the housing committee I have proposed and got the support of housing committee to guarantee sites during this administration, both in the Coldine, the one that's been referred to, and Dunster, and some of those that are coming forward. So we you know, have done that already, and I'm glad and welcome that it's becoming more of a wider priority, because I think the benefits are very clear. So to try and run through the other questions, or the other very positive thing I feel about the community land trust movement, you know, co-ops, and it's a whole range of different things, but it does offer a new way of working and living together, or being together, and I think that is, you know, it can be quite fraught, but it's also quite interesting and quite exciting, and that's something that other forms of housing don't offer. So I think that's another real plus. I was asked, what is a single thing that I would do? And I think we've touched on it a bit, and it refers to one of the other questions. Obviously, you know, support with sites is important, but finance is so crucial, and finance can so constrain. I'm passionate about affordable rents, or rather truly affordable rents, or living rents, and in order to do that, you've got to make the finance as favourable as possible. So I would say, and I would pledge, you know, on behalf of the Green Party, that we would definitely support passing on borrowing, you know, a Public Works Loan Board, and passing on. It doesn't have to be passed on at a market rate. There are ways around it, the size of the loan, social value considerations. It doesn't have to be, and I know that hasn't been considered to put on. There's all sorts of complicated matrices you can do, but that is something that also we have reserves as a council, and I kind of almost speculatively during the budget said, well, can we have some of this reserve to support homeless provision? There's over 50 million, and that's not including the work, I'm getting a bit technical, not including the working balance, which you're not supposed to touch. 50 million sitting in earmarked reserves. Could we have some of this waste PFI reserve? 400,000. Officers said it was okay, and we got it. So there's more scope than people realise, and the reserves are actually providing very, very low rates of return, and therefore it would be reasonable to offer shorter term loans. And I appreciate, having looked at some of the finances of these projects, that often the short-term finance is the really expensive finance. I'm seeing a nod over there, so that's encouraging. And that's where we could probably, as a council, offer even more help and make things more viable. If you make them more viable, then you can have lower rents. If you have lower rents, then they're more accessible and affordable for people that need the housing. So that is the single biggest, most important thing that I would want to work on. Which is my favourite was another question, and there's a couple already been mentioned, so I've been slightly, I spoke to Ian at the Coldine and said, oh, yours is my favourite, I'm going to say that, and then I thought about it, and I thought, actually, no, I quite like the Sussex Homeless Support one, so I'm going to mention both, and I'll tell you very briefly why. I think the Coldine one is brilliant because it's grassroots, and they're doing something that hasn't been mentioned so much that a lot of these schemes do, which is have incredibly high eco standards. We're in a climate emergency. We're committed as a council to carbon neutrality in the city by 2030, and Coldine is planning to be off-grid, which will be utterly amazing. So that is a huge plus, but also, as has already been mentioned, the community facilities, the sports hall, and alongside all that, a commitment for 100% affordable. How many developers come forward with anything like that? How can the council not, back this with zest and energy? And of those, a large proportion, for 40%, will come from council housing lists. So it'll be relieving, some of the most acute need in the city. But I have to just very briefly mention Sussex Homeless Support, because that is also a really fantastic project in terms of harnessing, the energies of homeless people to do something very practical and very concrete and on a shoestring. Mary's talked about finance, and that is really on a shoestring and a fantastically exciting project, which I really, and I know that Sussex Homeless Support have had to duck and dive and haven't been always helped as much as they were like, and Jim will probably say more about that later on in the meeting, by the council. But they are, that would be tremendous if that could come off. So I think I've answered all the questions, because the other one was about loans and passing on, and I'm saying yes. It's none of us know what's going to happen in the election, but I think we're all saying we're keen on community-led housing, and we will certainly be going for the finance side of things in order to unlock affordability. That is all I want to say. So, thank you.
Great. So, thank you very much. I'm feeling a bit more encouraged than I did yesterday, listening to you all. So, time for questions. We've got until 8 o'clock. We've got an hour. So, nearly everyone who's got a question should be able to ask it, I think. Who wants to go first? Jim.
Go for it, Jim. So Sussex Home Support and community led for Mears. 2017 councillors at a committee meeting, voted 100%, all parties, that the community, us, would be given an empty council property and we could run with that to create our own night hostel or whatever we decided we wanted to do with it, to try and help the homeless crisis. And here we are, 2.5 years later, and we've never even been inside a building. We asked for lists for 6 months and never seen a list for 6 months. So what you need to convince me of is, can the councillors, regardless of which party they are, control the council? Because it's great giving us all this information about what you're going to do as councillors. But I think the fight is not between the councillors and the public. I think the fight is between the public, the councillors, against the council, because the council themselves seem to be the ones that are obstructing every single piece of paper you put forward. It's an automatic obstruction. So convince me, whether it's individual or as a group, that you can tackle the council. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll ask each person to reply, but you can go in the order that you decide yourselves.
I'm quite happy to go first. You're absolutely right. And the issue is, no disrespect to any administration that's been after hours, if you are in the administration, you lead that administration. You are the council, and the officers take their policies from you. We seem to be working the other way round at the moment. We have officers dictating what councillors will do, and that they're bypassing councillors. That is not how a council should be run. And I can assure you, because I've run one, you give a direction from the top and that goes right down through the bottom, and that's what the council does. What we have now is we have councillors here, not so much perhaps in the administration, but we have councillors, and I'm sure Councillor Gibson will agree with me, we find out second hand. And that is not how it should be. Some of us are quite forceful and say, what's this, what's that? But it shouldn't be that way round. As an administration, you give a policy, and those officers are paid employees of the council to deliver it. And at this moment in time, I totally agree with you, because it's not happening.
Who would like to go next? Will you respond to that? Anything to add?
Yeah. As the only person on the panel who is not a sitting councillor, I'm at a bit of a disadvantage for the inside track on this. So I thought I'd get my 2 pence out quickly so that we can move on to hopefully more informed voices. But from the outside in, it does seem to me as though what Mary said makes sense. It does seem as though the local civil service does do a lot of work that would normally be done by the councillors themselves in planning applications, giving recommendations beyond what I gather is normal for a council of this type. So I think there is an issue of orders just simply not being conveyed, not being actioned in the proper way, and everything going a bit topsy-turvy. And if I can see that from the outside, then it must be quite a big problem. Anyway, I'll pass on.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of can relate very much, because I feel like I've almost been through that whole process that Jim's describing. You know, we got the motion through, as he says, with unanimous support, and it unlocked a huge amount of enthusiasm. And we were going around buildings that were offered by developers, and the motion was about council buildings. And from that, various groups have emerged. But the first thing was that community reps felt like the professional homeless organisations were trying to take it over, so that was a complication. And then it was reconstituted as a community homeless action group, chaired by councillors, myself and Claire, and Mary's recently joined it, and where officers and community reps could challenge the council and what they were doing on homelessness and how they were spending their money and why haven't we had the list and things like that. And even that with, you know, councillors chairing, and it has been painfully slow in many respects. I think it has had some benefits and it has achieved some accountability, but the bottom line is it's the mindset, it's the attitude, and what really kind of makes me ashamed to be part of the council, even as an opposition councillor, is when Jim comes to these meetings and he said, we are housing 15 homeless people in our bus on the seafront, and some of them, you know, no one will have and have been brought to us by the police, and the council won't even give us access to electricity or a tap. Now that is not the right mindset, and that mindset has got to change, and it's probably got to change for, you know, still further for community land trusts, but it's got to change in terms of how we work with homeless organisations and voluntary groups in the city. And all I can say is, you know, I feel that, and I will, with my heart, will do what I can in the future to facilitate that in whatever role I end up being if I'm re-elected.
Okay, so I think this is a question more about homelessness than it is about community-led housing necessarily, not that that's a problem. So there was a campaign led by prominent... by the way, does everyone know which party everyone is? Was that sort of like... Because we didn't actually say that, did we?
I'm sorry.
So, I mean, I said I was Labour, so... Yeah, and David has said he's Green and
I'm Conservative.
So I just thought there might be people who didn't know that. So there was a...
Sorry, Lib Dem. Not the continuity Liberals, so as far as I'm aware, they're not set up here.
There was a campaign to open a shelter that went through the council, and that resulted in the Brighton Centre opening a winter night shelter for about 30 people. And that was very much a sort of cross-party thing that involved volunteers as well. So that was an example of someone coming to the council with an idea. There's so much passion in this city about homelessness and rough sleeping. We can all see that it's a huge thing. So so no wonder there are so many people who really want to do something about that. And when those people came to the council, the result was a winter shelter that was set up in the Brighton Centre. And that has now been expanded, and we now have funding for a year-round night shelter. That was agreed in our last budget just a few weeks ago. And as well as that, this council for the first time has a lead member for rough sleeping, and David referred to Councillor Claire Moogan. She's done a fantastic job of bringing people together across the council and also across the city in order to put together a strategy for rough sleeping in order to try and reduce the problem as much as possible. And we've been really successful recently as well at getting funding bids. We had a massive piece of funding from the government around homeless prevention, and this is about preventing people from sleeping rough in the first place by addressing the problems that they're facing much earlier. And the council is now in a position where it can be much more proactive with people. It is reaching out into communities, and it's talking to people like GPs, for example. When someone goes to a GP, is it possible for them to pick up that this person might be at risk of homelessness, and then try and refer them to a council officer who can give them advice about how to prevent, these things from sort of, spiralling downwards, so that person doesn't end up sleeping rough in the first place. And that's been a really successful project, and it has prevented people from sleeping in the streets, because that's what we ultimately want to do. At the last Housing and New Homes Committee, there were a couple of papers there about funding for facilities which are there to channel rough sleepers off the streets and into housing. One of them is called No First Night Out, and that is going to be a facility open 24 hours a day, and that is to deal with people who show up, who are referred there because they are in danger of sleeping rough that night. They don't have anywhere to sleep that evening for the first time. And you don't want people to do that. You want to do everything you can to try and prevent that situation from occurring in the first place. And we have won almost £2 million from the government in order to set up that brand new facility. So there is a lot going on in this area, and we are proactively working across the community to try and do even more, because we're really aware of how passionate people are about this issue.
Actually, just a quick supplementary. This question of there being too much officer control and not enough management. Do you think that's a function of it being a minority? We've never had a majority administration.
No. Well, just very quickly, before 2007, there was the Labour administration, and they had more numbers then, but from 2007 to now, it's always been a minority administration. So it is how the administration leads. It's how you set your policies, and it's how you take it through the system. And unless you make it very clear from top to bottom, I'll give you an example. A very senior officer spoke to me after we came out of administration, and he said, "Mary, I have to say one thing about you." He said, "From the top to the bottom, we knew what we were doing. Didn't always agree with you, but we knew exactly what we were supposed to be doing. And unless administration sets out its policies through a council, you get what we've got now. We're being taken over. Officers are making decisions where councillors are finding afters." And just very quickly, I will just touch on, Tracey Hill mentioned about the papers that went to housing. We had 3 papers at the last housing committee, 3. Each one of them were asking the housing committee to give delegated powers to the director of adult social care. We have no committee for adult social care. There's no accountability. There will be no report back, and they were all out of the housing revenue account. And that shows how little control the administration has around the council overall.
Well, actually, I think if you ask officers, they would probably prefer it if there was either a majority or a cabinet system, to be honest, because it is quite difficult sometimes. We've had a minority for quite a few years, and it is quite difficult sometimes when you've got an administration that wants to do something, but then they can't because they can't get quite enough support from the other parties. So I actually think that officers would prefer a little bit more clarity, but it's not up to them. Obviously, it's up to the people who vote. So that's all I'd say about that. What Mary just said, I do have to correct her. There were 3 papers going to committee. None of them involved funding from the HRA.
Yes, they do.
No, none of them did. So sorry about that. I mean, people probably don't even know what the HRA is, but I think Mary is trying to allege that money that tenants pay through their rents is being funneled into other areas, and that is absolutely false, I'm afraid.
I'm really sorry, I don't want to get involved in an argument. There's one particular paper that went to housing where the HRAs are being asked to spend £3 million to buy a property for adult social care. So that is out of the housing revenue account, and I don't want to get in an argument tonight. Thank you.
I'm going to try and close off the argument. Mary is right about the Hollandbury Library. The 2 other papers were general fund and therefore paid by council taxpayers, and some of the Hollandbury Library was also general fund, but there was some capital input, so you could be a bit right and slightly more right.
But as you said yourself, David, at the meeting, the money is going to come straight back, so there will be no loss to the HRA.
Yes. Yeah.
Anyway,
it's wrong to say that tenants are paying
argument.
for
it. We won't go there.
Yeah, it's wrong to say that tenants are paying.
So to finish this bit off,
sorry about that.
No, that's fine.
We can't help it.
I'm going to exploit the position that I've got sitting here, thinking to myself, actually, if there is a problem, what I'd want is all the councillors to work together to fix it. Because if we have another minority administration, I don't want to see this problem continuing. So I would leave any of them with the challenge.
And can I just add that whoever ends up being the largest party in the next administration, would it be possible for you to consider forming a coalition government rather than a minority government? Because then at least you'd have some medium-term stability within the structures. You'd have more force to get things through. You'd be sure on...
We have a coalition already.
So minority government.
Let's move to the next question, because I wanted the last word on that one. At the back.
Okay, I'm John Alcock. I'd like to just come back to this thing about the housing crisis and then pose my question really. We're in a housing crisis because the Conservative government in the 1970s sold off all that social housing, which was self-regenerating, from rents that paid to maintain that social housing and rents that paid to build more social housing. Actually, that social housing was built both by Labour governments and Conservative governments prior to that period of time. And we're in this situation now because all that stuff's been sold off and there's no rents that are coming into the local authorities, and also local authorities funding has been cut massively, £100 million over the past 10 years. So we're in this situation because of the Conservative government, and there's no other way we can think about it. Plus, what the government's doing is also enabling private developers to make huge profits out of completely unaffordable housing. We know that, most of us here will know that the government's definition of affordable isn't affordable, and that's going on in our city now. So in relation to community land trust developments, which I wholeheartedly support and I think we should facilitate in any way possible, I just ask how we can ensure that those developments, and hopefully more developments in the future, are sustainable and affordable in perpetuity for our community. So I'd just like to hear from the panel how we think that can happen.
Okay, so I'll go first. Okay, I don't mind going first. Thank you for your question. Just to go back to your first statement, and I'm assuming you're talking about right to buy and other parts that went through. I'm a local councillor. I was elected locally. I'm not nationally, so I don't have any influence in the House of Commons. I think we need to recognise after right to buy, the Labour government never changed right to buy at all, and have never made any attempt to readdress the problem that you're mentioning. But I think the most important thing, we can all talk about national issues, and well, actually I don't turn the television on at the moment because I think it's all bonkers, but there you go. I can't listen to it anymore. But I think locally, as a council, we have a responsibility. We have a housing crisis in the city. We understand that. We have a homeless crisis in the city. And it's down to the council and collectively for groups on the council to work for the best interests of the city. And that is their remit, and that's what we need to do. So nationally, I can't change it. I have no power over it whatsoever. As a local council and council, we have a voice. And that is where we need to be challenging that view to ensure that housing is a top priority. As I've said, it should always be a top priority for the council, always. And we will endeavour, particularly through our party, because I am passionately committed to housing. Hopefully I'll get re-elected, but I haven't got a crystal ball. None of us know what's going to happen. But it has to be a top priority, and it has to be affordable. We have to house our young people. We have to make sure our older residents can move from large houses into smaller houses, so that they're, the end of their life, their years, they're not lonely out on the estates. There's so much that we can do locally that we have to address as a local council, and that has to be our priority. Thank you.
Who'd like to go next?
I'll go next. I'd actually like to disagree with that quite strongly, because of course the national picture feeds into the local picture. It is ultimately right to buy and the local government cuts that force us into such a bad situation in terms of housing and in terms of homelessness. And there's not really much that can be got away with that. Anything we do at the local level is going to be trying to blunt the effects of these things. Ultimately, nationally, there's going to have to be a change as well. Nationally, we need to have it so that councils can revoke the right to buy within their areas. We need to have it that the housing stock stops being depleted at such a steady rate. We need to have it that we're actually building more houses and the planning restrictions are there and there is funding from the government to allow it to happen. The local policy doesn't operate in a vacuum. We have to work hard here as well. We have to make sure that the right money goes to the right places. We have to make sure that we get the affordable houses and we stick to our targets. But it doesn't operate in a vacuum. There's a national picture as well. Both are important, and that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
I think the national context is obviously important, and but I'll focus mostly on the local. And I think in terms of the local, one of the answers I gave was, you know, it's getting the finance and enabling the finance to stack up, which I hope was addressed. But if you talk about the national, which is also related to finance to some extent, I totally agree about the right to buy. That's one thing we generally disagree about. But the problem is that national policy has shifted from subsidising, supporting building to supporting rents. And that is not only very bad news, because it means that people have high rents and the support, there's huge housing benefit bills, but it also means that in the new builds, because there's no grants like there used to be, there's no ability to build at lower rent. So again, it comes down to finance. Now, research by an organisation called Shout, which was verified by Capita Economics and has now become much more mainstream, basically shows that not only is it more cost effective, it's more cost effective if you subsidise building and then you can charge lower rents. It's more cost effective. It costs you a little bit more in the first place, but then in the long run you're charging lower rents, which is costs far less in the long term in housing benefit. And I think that argument has been won. I think it's probably been won by most parties now, and that is definitely is definitely the way the way forward. So that would be one thing that nationally I really hope will happen very soon. It's a no-brainer, to be honest. We've got to shift subsidy to building from rent support. I said already local finance, and I've made a little note about giving priority for more beneficial schemes like community land trusts over private schemes, because that seems to make sense to me in terms of support and sites. But what I would say is the council has a fantastic opportunity at the moment to do a lot more. The current programme has of council house building has achieved just under 200 new, not quite as affordable as social rents by a long chalk homes, and about 230 have been lost in the last 4 years to the right to buy. So that's a net loss. It's a step forward, but it's still a net loss. However, we have been, and I would, you know, I wouldn't put the blame on Tracey's shoulders, but I would put it on, you know, somewhere, you know, the last 4 years have been sitting on borrowing capacity to build homes at affordable rents, and sometimes truly affordable rents, of just over 40 million, and there's still about 31.5 million left, and that is tragic, and that is a real missed opportunity. But what that missed opportunity is for the incoming council is a fantastic opportunity, because not only is that money that should have been spent wasn't spent, but now the borrowing cap's been lifted. It's you know, and thanks to the Conservative government for doing that. It should never have been there in the first place, but anyway, at least it got lifted. So there's a fantastic opportunity there, and in addition to that, there's a real build-up, and this is another sort of slight waste in terms of what we could have achieved. There's a real build-up in right to buy. We have to spend the right to buy money within 3 years. The council are struggling to do that, and if we don't do that, it goes back to the government. So that means there is a huge pot of right to buy, and if it doesn't get abolished, that will continue to come through. Plus this, you know, borrowing that hasn't been used, and which is why the Green Party are saying, and we believe, and there'll be answers in the council questions hopefully tomorrow which will demonstrate it, we believe it's quite possible for the council, not possible, we're pledging that if we in some, achieve a majority administration, that we will build 600 new council homes, and that is costed and it adds up and it's doable. It's not all doom and gloom. It can be done. We haven't used the resources to the full that we had, but we definitely should and must in the future, and that must include community-led housing, because that qualifies for this kind of support as well.
Thank you. Well done.
So the reason why we have a housing crisis is for quite a few of the reasons that John said, plus other members of the panel, and we can't ignore that. We need a government which will enable councils to build council housing on a much bigger scale than they are currently doing, and that means that we need a government that has the will to do that, like a Labour government would. If you look at the stats across the country of how many new council homes councils are managing to build, it's inadequate. It just doesn't meet the requirement for genuinely affordable homes that people have. As David said, over the last 4 years, we have delivered around about 200 new council homes in the city, and there's another 90 on the way. That means they've gone through the planning process. And that compares very favourably with previous administrations in the city, and it does compare pretty favourably with other places as well. But I do agree that we need to do a lot more. The lifting of the cap on HRA borrowing is very welcome, and it does enable us to plan better. The cap has acted as a brake, because even if you're below the borrowing level, you have to look forward several years at a time. But now that cap has been lifted, we can increase capacity, we can bring forward a lot more sites than we have been able to do previously. We are working on that already. We've got loads more people in to do all of that. And Labour's manifesto commitment is that we want to deliver 800 new council homes in the city over the next 4 years, which is quadrupling what we've managed before. And that is, a reflection of what David says, that it's absolutely imperative that we do more. There is no commitment in the Conservative manifesto whatsoever to affordable housing. In fact, affordable housing isn't even mentioned in the Conservative manifesto for Brighton and Hove. So how does this relate to community-led housing? I think that we do need, as I said earlier, I do think we need to see community-led housing groups as enablers that can help us get to our targets. One thing that may help, and this might link in as well with what David said about right-to-buy receipts, is that it is possible, I believe, for community-led groups and organisations like the CLT to become registered providers, which means that the council recognises that they are contributing to our providing for our affordable housing need in the city and providing housing here for the people who need it the most. And I think that's something that might have been mentioned already, but it's certainly something that I think we need to look at so that we can see if we can work more in partnership in order to get to where we need to be.
Thank you. I'll just say one quick thing that in response to John's questions about protecting housing in perpetuity. One of the values of community land trust owning the land and property is that that's what they're designed to do. They are designed to not allow, there's no right to buy with a community land trust owned scheme. And that's the most important thing about it. There is the right, and even if we become a registered provider, then we've got the option to not do right to buy. We wouldn't ever do right to buy because of that, because you've got to protect it for future generations. Thank you, Andrew.
I'm from the Starlings Housing Cooperative. We are an intergenerational housing cooperative. And we have really battled to sort of get any land, which has really stalled our progress. We've done a lot of work, we've done business plans and so forth, and we've put proposals forward. And now we're wanting to apply for a grant, but we don't have any land. So is there any, are you doing anything at the moment where we can find out what's available, what we can base our business case on? Because we've done it before, and as you say, we work as a we work voluntarily. People are really busy, so we've got a housing crisis, but also the wages haven't sort of risen accordingly. So working on a voluntary basis is quite hard for a group to do, because you put the work in and then you find out that the land's not available and you have to start again. So are you doing something now, where we can find out what's happening with the land sort of quite quickly, rather than waiting months to find out that it's not available? And another thing is, you mentioned sort of the value of a community, sort of that it's community-led housing, but also that there might be allocations sort of off of the council list. And if you are putting a community together, you have to have people sort of shared visions and values who want to live in a community. And that can be a bit problematic if you are taking people off of a housing list who perhaps don't want to live in that way. And how would you sort of address that? So it's not just a tick box exercise, you actually have a housing co-op that is enriching the community, and sort of all getting along, because that's part of it, affordable housing and the community.
So because you've got two parts to that question, I think the first part is probably the part that the panel can answer, whereas the part about how do you get people who aren't part of your group to become part of your group probably wouldn't be the job of the council to do, but probably would be how the groups would need to work with that allocations policy. So I don't know if
would that ever change, the allocations policy? Would you have to have allocations from? Would that always be part of it, that you would have to? Because we've got mixed tenure, so we're going to have people who affordable housing and people who own right out kind of thing in our business model. So would we have to use council? Have to have people from the housing list, or would you have scope for that not to happen in community housing?
So there are probably people who can answer this better than me, but what I would say, and tell me if I'm not right, that it depends on, if you were leasing land from the council, there might be that as part of the conditions for the lease.
Yeah.
Is that right? But if you weren't leasing the land...
Bunker can talk about it. Bunker, if they get a lease from the land, then they take nominations. That's how it works. You get free land, you get to take nominations, but if you're developing commercially, you pay a certain amount of value for the land, then it's a mix. But what I would say is, generally, we encourage groups to be open to all kinds of people from whatever walk of life, and that's part of the value of the schemes, is that you have a mix. You have, in some of our bigger schemes, you have rich people and you have poor people. You have all sorts of people. You have families, you have not families. You have all sorts of. And it's really important to be.
So we encourage groups. It's not my concern. What I'm saying is, I would just be with someone who's there's a group of people, and you just have to. Do you know what I mean? That's not my concern. I'm organised.
So shall we take the first part of your question for the panel to answer? Thank you.
But I can't quite see. We've got an officer here today. We have an officer in the council that's working quite closely now with Community Land Trust around working forward. So my suggestion to you, I'm sorry, I don't know your one. I know I've written down your housing starting. No, I've written that down, but I hadn't heard of it. But my suggestion to you would be to make sure that you contact the council, and I don't know if you have.
I've gone through the CLT.
Yeah, but I would contact the council as well, because they are starting to do more work with Community Land Trust, and I think you need to actually then sort of start engaging with them. And as Tracey's already said, they've identified 10 sites in their manifesto, so obviously there is land that they're going to bring forward, which is quite interesting. Just very quickly on the nomination, Mike, I think you'll find it is around local connection as well, because that will be the key. Because if the council is giving land, other parts, they would want to see nominations locally, and that will be an absolute key.
Who wants to go next?
Yeah, I think, in terms of the land, the funding to the CLT, that's to develop a pathway and you know, part of that is about how do you go about, you know, finding land. You know, what do you do about that? And that sounds like you're already in the loop in terms of that. There is a shortage of land in Brighton Hove, and I think we all know that. You know, so it isn't easy finding land. And another thing I would say is we are keen for the council to be as supportive as possible about community-led housing, but I don't think it's. I think it would be a pity if people were limited to think that the only options are land that's owned by the council, because it could be that there's really good land out there that is within reach to a group that isn't owned by the council. Because then, if you can think that broadly, then you know, there are way more options open. So that's what I'd say there.
Have you actually identified 10 sites or not? Or are you in the process?
We have committed that to identifying 10 sites.
So if we haven't identified any yet?
So
not yet, no.
Why 10 specifically? Why not just the amount that are suitable?
Well, because we felt it was important to actually put a number on it, rather than being wishy-washy and saying, oh, community-led housing is fantastic and we totally support it. We think it's important to actually have some ambition in terms of this is a measurable thing that we are intending to do.
But what if you find 9 suitable sites and 1 site that's a bit iffy, and you had one taking it? That's why I don't think you should put a number on it before you've done the analysis.
Well, thank you for your advice.
Yeah, just should I stand up?
Yeah.
But yeah, I just want to say a little bit about putting numbers on things, and I think it's really important to do a bit of preparation and analysis before you do it, even in an election period, because, you know, I don't want to be, I don't like being tribal, but the people of Brighton and Hove were promised 500 new homes by the last administration. And on one leaflet it said 500 a year, which is 2,000, and I've got it somewhere. And then it was revised to 500 over the period. But you know, at a generous measure, 200 were achieved, and that doesn't help the credibility of us as politicians if we, you know, or if a promise is made. So, you know, so what I would say about the 800 is, well, do we divide, you know, do we take 40% like the last promise that was made? And what I would say is our 600 is really worked out, and I'm a finance bore, and I promise you it's definitely doable. So I think I think it's good to do numbers because it demonstrates ambition, but you have got to do the work behind them, and it's not entirely clear that has been done with these 10 sites. But you know, if it can be done, great. But let's hope it's not, you know, 40% of that in 5 years' time. Just on in terms of I think part of your question was a little bit about the motivation of people coming in, because a co-op often requires a commitment and motivation. But I wouldn't, and I think the points have been made that if you are coming from, if the council are putting in resources, then they want to see some benefit in terms of waiting lists and need, and that's fine. And it may be that your scheme, isn't using council land, or other discounts and finance that help it. But if it was, I'm sure it's possible to find, of the 11,000 people on the waiting list, some people that are really, motivated and would welcome that kind of situation. So I don't think it's a barrier, but I accept that it's a factor that needs to be thought of, and I think is being handled in some of the schemes that are going forward. And I totally agree with Tracey that I don't think it's a question of just looking at land that the council owns or has a say in. There's, the council, let's be honest, let's be truthful, the council are going to think, well, if we've got this land, let's do it for, 100% council housing. So it may be that there are bits, and I know the example of Bunker is a really good one. There are bits of land that it makes more sense both for the council and for the co-ops to develop. But a large site, I think, is quite unlikely. Look at the others, and I think that what the council should be doing with the privately owned sites or different sites is saying, well, how can we help you have a bit of an advantage when competing with other people that want to buy it in terms of finance. Yeah. Oh, well, thanks for that. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, I've said the right thing. I'll sit down.
Thank you. At the back.
I'm particularly director of the Labour Council. If there is a severe shortage of land in Brighton Hove, is it the current council policy to allow affordable developers to use the land better by increasing the density, which would allow more affordable housing to be squeezed out of particular land? I mean, many of our favourite sites and Grade 1 listed buildings were built at high density, and if planned properly, would that be an option?
Well, I mean, what we want to do is maximise density without compromising on people's quality of life, and a lot of that is about good design. And there is now a design panel. Quite a lot of developers actually take advice from the design panel about this is more of a planning thing. But well, yeah, I mean, we absolutely want to squeeze in, as you put it, as many homes as possible. But we don't want to do it, you know, at the expense of the people who are going to live there and the people who are going to live nearby and so on. So it's all got to be, you know, to a certain degree.
I just wanted to add a bit on that around planning actually, because the council's policy on affordable housing is 40%. Now these schemes go to planning committee, and the council makes its request for 40%, and inevitably developers will come back with a viability and say they can't deliver 40%, so we want it anyway. And actually, in my view, the council should be firmer. That is the council policy for 40% affordable housing. If you want to build in this city, then actually you need to work with the council to provide affordable housing. You know, if you need to go a bit higher, a bit wider, but we need to build houses. And many schemes, I have two colleagues that sit on planning, so from my ward, I visit planning often. So it's interesting to see different schemes coming through, and time again, these big developments, they come forward, 40%, and then they do a viability, and it's, oh, well, we really would like to do that for you, but it might be 25, might be 20, might be 15. And that is where the council should actually say, no, go back and look at the scheme again, but they don't. It's quick, get it through planning, get it through planning. And that, and I know Tracey wants to come in on that, but it is actually a fact. If you can go online and webcast and watch planning, it's quite interesting, but you will see major schemes coming through where the viability is drastically reducing affordable housing, and the longer you allow that to happen, the less affordable housing you're going to deliver in the city.
Sorry, can I just ask you to say, what do you think are the levers that the planning committee has got to increase affordability that it's not using?
Well, the council has a policy of 40%. We have planning committee members, but we have a recommendation from planning officers, and it'll come forward, and they will work, developers work with planners before it comes to planning. So there will be this whole thing around viability, transport. But we often see schemes come back because they go, well, yes, but we can't, now it's not viable. There's so many. We've got big ones in their own ward, with a major one in the High Street in Rottingdean and other areas in Hove. They come forward, and then the affordable is reduced dramatically. We're never, ever going to deal with affordable housing in this city if we allow planning development to continue like that.
Do you want to first?
Tracey.
Developers have the right to make a viability claim.
Yeah.
That is not something that the council particularly wants or encourages. But the developer can claim that due to their costs of developing the site, it isn't viable to provide 40% affordable. The procedure then is that has to be independently assessed, and if the independent assessment comes back and says yes, they have an argument, then the planning committee has to accept it. And if they don't, the developer can appeal that decision with the government, and the decision will be overturned. Okay? So there is a limit to what the council can do in this regard, and the only thing that can change that is a reform of national legislation when it comes to land valuations and this viability loophole, which is allowing developers to get away with developing far less affordable than they can really afford. An example of this recently, there was a development in Hove. It should have provided 40% affordable. They claimed they made a viability argument. The independent assessor came back and said 25% was viable. When they put it to planning committee, they only offered 17%.
Yeah.
Okay? Planning committee refused it. Okay? They appealed the decision. The developer appealed the decision to the planning inspectorate. In the meanwhile, they reduced their affordability offer from 17% down to 10%. The planning inspector allowed the appeal. So that development will go ahead with 10% affordable, even though it was refused by the planning committee. That is the situation that we are in, and only national legislation is going to change that. A Labour government would do that, this Conservative government wouldn't.
I think there's a gentleman at the back wanting to ask a question.
Sorry, I'd just like to chip in about the affordable housing aspect. First of all, this is actually also in the Lib Dem manifesto, and I'd imagine the Green manifesto as well. It's not a purely Labour thing. But I also have to say that there are councils which do a much better job at actually meeting their affordability targets. A few weeks ago I was looking at the figures for the London boroughs, and like here, most of them aren't exactly doing fantastically at meeting their targets. We're at about 20% here, I think, and aiming for 40. They have a range between about 30 and 50. However, Lewisham Borough Council was able to consistently meet their target, which is more ambitious than the Brighton Hove target of 50% affordable each year, year on year, for 4 years running. So I'm not quite sure what they're doing, but there are clearly some levers that they have access to, and surely the next administration, no matter what colour it is, multicolour, single colour, whatever, can look and do a case study on what they're doing differently to the other London boroughs and to us. And as for density, high density is nice in the city centre. I'd be very much in favour of that where appropriate. Thank you.
Just quick, very, very quick remarks. I think the debate's gone, the right way in terms of that there is a need for national reform, but it doesn't mean that we can't push harder locally. Nearby there's the Astoria, that's 0% affordable, and I'm minded to think about the King Alfred, which is a fairly low proportion, and then the developer comes back and says, oh, well, building costs have changed and the market's not quite what we thought, so we've got a viability gap. We can't deliver on your affordable housing. And because we need to make a 20% profit, and we need to make that 20% profit even though we're getting a grant from the government. And I think the solution increasingly, and I hope there's a consensus building amongst all the parties on this, is that the council do the developments themselves. We do not, as a council, need to make that 20% profit. So automatically we can achieve a lot more. So I think that is definitely a way forward. Density is really important wherever possible, but it has to be compatible with, kind of living arrangements that work, and I realise sometimes that's difficult. But one thing that hasn't been mentioned that is also important is the sort of eco standards of the housing and the impact it's going to make. We're building hopefully housing for 60, 100 years. It's got to be to much higher standards in terms of impact on the environment and carbon emission, and that's one of the great things that a lot of people in this room are doing and are ahead of the council, so it's a really good reason for supporting the movement.
Thank you. Julian, did you want to add something?
It's just pointing out that the issue about private developers being able to reduce the affordability quota makes it really hard for us community-led housing groups. I'm with Sussex Co-Housing, which is Brighton based. Because the private developers can build a high proportion of commercial houses, they can put a higher price on the land than we can, And we are trying to meet affordability levels as far as we can, probably more than the council require, if possible, because we want as wide a variety of people as possible, and we feel it's really important. We are trying to make it work by cross-subsidy to some extent, and by choosing our developer, who's been quite helpful to us, but they have to have a 20% profit in order to borrow the money to build the thing. But we are at this disadvantage that they're not able to bid on our behalf on land at a rate that is really commercial compared to commercial development.
Thank you. So we've
I
got...
think there was a gentleman at the back just there, straight ahead.
I'm sure there's a question there, but
yeah.
I think it was a comment to add.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It also raises the point that actually, if there's anything councils can do to open opportunities where community and housing has just a step, like even if a 6-month delay on a piece of land being offered to the private sector, as soon as it's out there in the sharp pit of private sector development, we're at a real disadvantage. But we can make things stack up on commercial bits of land with commercial offers, but we can't race against those developers who are just squeezing it down.
And also to point out social value as well.
Yeah.
Alongside that, someone mentioned that one.
Yeah.
Talk about affordability a lot. What is class as affordable housing in Brighton Hove regarding wages and money? Because what would be classed as affordable housing in Yorkshire would start at like maybe £400 a month to maybe £600 per annum. I know it's very different in this city. What is affordable housing here?
It's not defined by the wage, which is absolutely shocking. It's defined by market rent, so it's 80. Yeah, basically, it's slightly less unaffordable, up to 80% market rent, which is absurd. Really, the affordability targets should be the start, not the end.
Living with somebody else, whether you're or not, is pretty much their average house.
Unfortunately, it's going to get worse before it gets better, no matter what, unfortunately, and that's horrible.
We talk about affordable housing, but it's not affordable for some, not everyone.
It's just less unaffordable. It's trying to hold back the tide, really.
Tracey.
Yeah, I mean, the question of what's affordable is quite a big one. I mean, what Duncan's just mentioned is the government definition of affordable, which is 80% of market rent or shared ownership. Yeah. What we do with the registered providers that we work with is that we want to see them offering an LHA rent. In other words, a rent that is the maximum that you can get housing benefit paid up to, and that is quite a bit less than that. And what it means is that you don't have a gap. If you're reliant on housing benefit, you don't then have to top up the gap. What we're doing with what we're doing with the joint venture that we put together with Hyde Housing is that we did define affordable as something that related to local wages. So we defined a living wage rent as a household that were on a living wage. What could they afford? And that's something that we've taken now into our council housing as well. So we look at trying to do that as much as we possibly can. Ideally, we would provide housing at social rents, which is much lower than that. It's very, very difficult to do that because you've got all the costs of building, and you've got to pay them back over a period of time. Usually it works out that you have a big deficit. If you're only going to charge that kind of social rent, which would be ideal, you'd end up with a big deficit after 40, 60 years. So somehow you've got to find the money to plug that gap through a grant or through that money coming from somewhere else. But that is something that we would like to do, and we'll do it as much as we can.
I have to say things about rents as a founder of the Living Rent campaign. I couldn't miss this opportunity. That £400 in Yorkshire is about probably pretty close to an average council social rent in Brighton Hove. And the irony is places like Hull, for example, a private sector rent can be at the same level or even less. So as a council rent.
Yeah. And that was only 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah. So it really depends where you are in the country, and the problem we have here is that rents are incredibly high. And I have to make a small comment on the living wage rents for the joint venture, which is a step forward because it recognises that rent should be linked to affordability more than the market, you know, which in Hull is very different to Brighton. But the problem with that formula is that it makes it, instead of taking, as the living rent campaign would say, you should look at actual household incomes in the city and base your affordability on that. And it's not perfect, but it's based on the real household incomes. The living wage joint venture rents assume a certain number of household incomes coming in to the to a 1-bed and a 2-bed, and it conveniently achieves a rent which is just a little bit less than local housing allowance. So it's better, it's less. But what we have done through Housing Committee is enhance that, make the rents a bit lower overall, and offer a 27.5, you know, a much lower living wage rent level, which actually is a lot closer to what I would classify as a living rent and see as being truly affordable, or for most people, not for all, but for 15,000 people in the city, only social rents is affordable. And I think what is changing, and positively, is that there's a growing recognition that the council has to be finding ways, whether it's through a CLT or whether it's their own provision, of achieving larger numbers of living rents and social rents, because every right to buy property that's sold is at a social rent, and that's what's being lost. And we've got an amendment through budget which has made a reserve available, which will go some of the way. But as Tracey says, if you're going to do it big time, then you have to address investing in building rather than investing in rent support, which is where the grants come in. So that's the national way forward is grants, but there is more that we can do, and I think there's a growing consensus amongst the parties that we'll seek to do that in the next 4 years.
Thank you. We're going to have one more very quick question.
Hello, I'm a local architect, and a few of you have mentioned self-build schemes, which is great, and using the resources of local tradesmen and local skills is really great. But I think if community-led housing as a response to the housing crisis is going to be upscaled to an urban strategy, construction industry professionals should be proactively engaged, in my opinion, to work with communities, with the council, in facilitating your ambitions. So I wonder if any of you considered what steps you could take to engage construction industry professionals moving forwards.
I'll just give a very quick answer to that. As I said, I live in a self-build, and when there was quite a lot built across Brighton, particularly in the past. And the groups that worked them, they were groups of tradespeople, but they also had the council and professional advice. So it was there originally, and it's something, the house I live in is absolutely fine. You know, if you go around the city, if you go up Wilson's Avenue and different parts, all those are self-built. But they had professionals, they had the council, architects, as well as the community groups that were on those self-builds. So it's partnership. And that's how across the city they provided those homes. So you're absolutely right.
Any other comments?
I think I think there will be amongst the members of groups architects and professionals who are enthused and will contribute. And I'm thinking of Ian in Coldine, and I think he's an architect. Tracey's nodding, and he's done an enormous amount of work and planning and thinking about how to create really sort of off-grid homes and designs for other stuff, and that's a fantastic resource compared to where in the council where we have to pay for everything.
Can I just say something?
Yeah.
I'm an architect as well, and I'm on the team for the CLT, so part of my role is to go out and talk to architects and other members of the building industry. and I'm trying my best as a single person trying to get out there as much as possible to talk to various different forums and networking events and everything about what we do. So I'm trying my best on my own to do it, but I welcome any help.
You're doing a very good job.
Okay, we've come to the end of our time this evening, so I'd like us all to show our thanks for the panellists for the questions they've asked, and also for you, the audience, for the questions you've asked.